Seattle City Councilwoman and Socialist Alternative member Kshama Sawant announced this week that she will not be seeking re-election to the city council. Instead, she's founding a new labor organization called Workers Strike Back. In a guest article for The Stranger, a Seattle-based newspaper, she articulated the need for an independent workers' movement. I'm going to read a brief section of that right now. We're not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but she says, "We cannot put our faith in the AOCs or the Pramila Jayapals, even though I understand there were many who had high expectations for them. AOC recently claimed that she could not fight against Democratic leaders on behalf of workers because it would cause relational harm." That was the video that we covered. And I knew that relational and reputational harm was going to be bad for her.
Yes.
What about the vast and very real harm taking place in the absence of such a fight for our needs? Meanwhile, the organization that should be holding AOC and the squad accountable, the DSA, appears to be unwilling to do so. It gives me no pleasure to say this because I am currently a member of DSA, but the DSA leadership has, for the most part, provided cover for the misleadership of the squad. There is a vacuum of real left leadership, locally and nationally. We need a new party for the working people, one that holds elected officials accountable, that bases itself on social movements, that organizes alongside workers on the streets and in workplaces. And I think all of that is exactly right. I want to share one more exhibit here from workersstrikeback.org. There are 5 demands as a movement here. 1, workers need a real raise. 2, good union jobs for all. 3, fight racism, sexism, and all oppression. Quality, affordable housing, and free health care for all. No more sellouts. We need a new party. She calls out AOC and the squad in that article and mentions that, look, Socialist Alternative has picked some fights with the DSA, and there's a lot of crossover between them. It's not one or the other. Kshama is a member of both. And I think, look, she's exactly right. Somebody has to lead a charge here. And I understand people have mixed reactions to this because it sucks certainly for the people of Seattle to lose someone like that who has delivered many, many wins for that city. She won $15 an hour in Seattle before the Sanders campaign, when that became thought of as a national fight. Right. Like $15 an hour was not even a pipe dream at that point. When Sanders introduced it in 2015, that's when everybody said this is a pipe dream, this is unrealistic. It wasn't even that at that point. It was nothing. And she won it pretty fast after winning that seat. And, all sorts of things from the Amazon tax to renters' rights. She is a great fighter and a great champion for her people in Seattle. And so it's going to suck for them to lose her. But at the same time, she has enough star power, and she probably feels a need to take this more national, because as effective as she's been on the Seattle City Council, she's on the Seattle City Council. And if there was a broader movement of socialist organizers who really had the kind of fighting spirit that she had, she wouldn't feel a need to do this. She would have felt herself as one of many who are, carrying this torch. But as she says in this article, there aren't many. There aren't many. You look around, and even organizations like DSA have been co-opted to a large extent. And so that's why she's doing this. I don't blame her. Go ahead.
I think she's right. And I think what we really need is, we're going to be getting into the Cop City thing in Atlanta. What really strikes me about, for example, the George Floyd movement and many other actions, the CHOP zone, they're very leaderless. They're very directionless. Where there are leaders, very often they're poor leaders, or they're just scamming people, as turned out to be the case with the Black Lives Matter national leadership
there.
Yeah. there is all of this energy that is being put to no good purpose. And we do have a lack of credible voices and movement leaders that can really unite this fractious left. There is a willingness, and she identifies that in her article. There's more of a willingness of people to really put themselves on the line and fight the establishment and fight the system that you haven't seen since the Vietnam era. However, unlike in that era, it's scattered all over the place. There's really no focus. There's really no direction. The left didn't just start having the problem of internecine fighting. That's always characterized the left. But I think it's being exacerbated by the lack of a unifying agenda and focus to all of this energy. Everybody knows that the country is a shit show, but nobody seems to have a clear policy goal for fixing it. And she is articulating a clear policy goal. But I don't have to tell you, because it's a lot of what this show is about. And actually, this is not really new. We're just facing a new version of this. The identitarian left and the economic left being at odds with each other, that's an old story. It's just playing out in a more exaggerated form in some respects. In a way, actually, it's kind of inverted, because if you look at the fights that went on between those wings in the 60s, the economic leftists were a lot further than they are now. Whereas today it's the opposite. The identitarians are much more radical than the identitarians were then. The identitarians then were just about desegregation and whether that should be really the focus. Civil rights should be the focus. Whereas the economic left back then, they were straight up Marxist Leninists, right? So today we're more, perhaps Miss Sawant accepted, we're more just European style socialism, right? I mean, most of us are just kind of fighting for that. But hey, Sawant will run into that. Like, it is a problem. Like, if we do try to unite this fractious left, how are you going to do it? I saw that at Grand Central. We talked about that. You had the older organizers wanted to keep it on economics, wanted to keep it on class. As soon as they got a younger teachers union rep, it went to identity, and they shut it down right away.
Well, that's where some of the political party ambitions of this movement are a little bit less encouraging than the just straight up militant labor moves that they're talking about making, which we're going to get into in a second. But our Patreon caller, Ellen, turned her mic on. So do you want to chime in on this for a minute?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of a tactic, what y'all think about her including the language of we have to stop racism, sexism, and all forms of oppression, because we get back to that identitarian bit, which tends over the long haul, it seems to me, to overwhelm everything else you've already said. A, B, you've got this sort of loosey-goosey language. What does that mean? What do we mean, fight racism and sexism? Whereas in her other points, it was very concrete.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think that's a good point, and that relates to what we're going to get into next, because I think that is aimed more at the political party component, because you have to build coalitions to form a party, and a lot of the identity politics is good for bringing certain people into your movement. Now, those people can end up sabotaging it in the long run, which is the danger, right? And I'm not suggesting that she's doing it for cynical purposes. I don't believe she is. I mean, she held BLM vigils in City Hall when it was closed during the lockdowns. Yeah. So I think she very deeply cares about these issues. I'm not saying that she's being shallow or she's being opportunistic, but I do share your concern that once you open that door, you don't know what kind of elements are going to flood in. And how they're going to cause divisions in the ranks, which is why a lot of class organizing and labor organizing makes a point to sort of not necessarily shun that kind of stuff, but not to center it, as Russell was talking about when he filmed the railroad worker rally in Midtown Manhattan.
And you know what? I mean, that would be my answer. It's not that as leftists, we do care about things like we just aired your documentary that was all about the plight of migrants. It's not that we don't care about these things.
Right.
We are deeply suspicious of what we believe is a corporatized identity politics that is simply used to divide the working class, and the language of it and the tactics of it are so divisive that it, on the one hand, gets a lot of support from clickbait-seeking corporate media because they thrive on conflict, social media companies that elevate those conflicts, and deeply troubled narcissists for whom that language of attack, of hatred, of division deeply appeals. And even people who are simply looking for a way to channel their idealism, if they weren't disturbed narcissists before they got involved in those movements, they're going to be by the time they come out the other side.
Right.
So her saying we want to struggle against racism and sexism, these are classic left struggles. It's not the struggle, it's the approach, it's the tactic, it's the way that postmodernism has infected those movements. That is the objection.
But what I will say about this, though, even though, like I said, I share a lot of those concerns, Kshama has a proven track record of winning. Shama's a winner. She's a fighter. She doesn't lose. She won the minimum wage. She won renters' rights. She won the Amazon tax. She beat back a recall against her with our help. Like I said, you know, if I have any sort of criticism for her, it's with nothing but love and a desire to help. I love Kshama Sawant. I've never done a fundraiser for anybody. I've never been to a political fundraiser. Even Bernie, I never went to a fundraiser. I gave money online. But I actually helped host an online fundraiser for her to beat that recall, and she did. So she wins. She knows how to fight. She's tough. Now, again, from the political party standpoint, what works in Seattle will not necessarily work everywhere, which is where I have certain reservations about that component of it. In terms of her willingness and skill when it comes to just fighting for higher wages, nobody does it better than her. Nobody does it better than her, which means she's the perfect person to lead that kind of movement. And I think it's very, very exciting on that score.
Please clap.